We live in a modern world. Everything is possible. We fly to the moon. We decode the human gene. We invent new and better technologies to create, produce, and continuously improve the quality of our lives. The world today is a global market where products, labor, and money flow in an ever-expanding search for maximizing profits. Wherever there's a demand, there will be supply. We want something, someone will make sure we get it, for the lowest cost and the biggest profit. But it comes at a price. What if I told you that 27 million people are still enslaved today? Modern-day slavery has become a multi-billion-dollar business and is now the second largest criminal industry in the world. The U.S. government estimates that every year about 200,000 people are trafficked into and within the United States to be exploited as labor and sex slaves. About half of them are children. Modern-day slavery is not an overseas event. It is happening right here, right now, in your town.
Human trafficking is the abuse of people through force, fraud, or coercion, making them do something they don't want to do for no money or little money in either labor industry or into this commercial sex industry.
This is about the law of supply and demand, and they don't care where the victims come from. So we need to be alert and make sure that we educate our children and that we create opportunities. The thing that makes someone at risk is not having options.
I first heard the term human trafficking about a year and a half ago. I may have heard it before that, but I never registered with me. And I was listening to a new friend of mine speak about the issue. And I was embarrassed to say that I didn't know what she was talking about.
We have a form of modern-day slavery in the United States. It exists. And people need to be on the lookout, and people need to be aware and educated about it. Share it with your friends. Talk about it with people at a dinner party so that people can keep their eyes open. If they see something, just pick up the phone and call 888-3737-888.
And we would tell local stories of human trafficking behind gated communities in Orange County and open students' eyes to the issue locally, because oftentimes I think it was easy for students to recognize the problem on a global scale outside of the United States, but to take that next step and realize that it happens so close to home was big for me and my understanding of the issue.
And I was also really shocked to learn how much our actions and our demands on goods and services that we want to buy impacts trafficked victims.
And there are very few crimes I can think of, especially with women and children, short of domestic violence, that show such a degree of selfishness and greed and taking advantage of other people unreasonably than slavery. I don't think there's anyone in the world who can look at slavery and say it's tolerable or acceptable. It's outright inappropriate.
This is something that has to stop, and it's only going to stop when everybody gets involved.
Right now, what we encourage everyone to do is use a national hotline number, which will talk you through the things you need to go through as far as understanding the dynamics, and they'll help you understand what's going on in your neighborhood or what you're observing. That number is 1-888-3737-888.
Stop slavery. You can make a difference. Call the hotline 1-888-3737-888. Or for more information, go to ochumantrafficking.org.
I'm really proud of you guys for getting that 888-3737-888 number. That is a way that you can be ready if you see something unusual to call so someone will investigate. In a couple of weeks ago, my husband and I did a drive around with the Deputy Chief Derek Marsh that you saw in this video, and he kept pointing out places that we had been before when we did human trafficking cases right here in Westminster. And a couple of those places were just blocks from this church. Human trafficking exists right here. And in my role in the battle against human trafficking, What I do best is educating and equipping the church and the community. When I was living in Greece, I discovered human trafficking, and Ted, I am going to be praying for your relative that has been been taken in this horrible thing in Germany, has a really high rate as a destination country for human trafficking. But when I was living in Greece and I began to understand that human trafficking was around me and I didn't have eyes to see, I began studying. And human rights is one of the ways that we battle human trafficking. It's how the United Nations decided to pass the United Nations Protocol against modern-day slavery. It is something that we value as Americans. We live in a democracy, is that right? And you all are registered to go vote and speak your voice. What I discovered, though, historically, is we look at Athens as the birthplace of democracy. And modern-day democracy celebrates that every person has a voice. But I discovered that in that initial birthplace, only about 400 men had actual citizenship in this democracy. All of the rest of the people who were not landowners, who were slaves, who were women, they did not have a voice. So democracy has changed a lot. When I look at what I see in America and what my friends, I've lived overseas in so many different places, and what they see as the land of the free, and what we see in our community, the health services and the schools, we see lots of really good things, but we also don't always see what's underneath the surface. We don't see the roots. We don't understand that not everything is going well for every person. And there are people right here in our own communities who are being trafficked, and there are people who are vulnerable to become trafficked. And we want to begin to understand. So what I want to look at today is how we can identify people in our own community that are trafficking victims, but also how we can be part of the solution globally, because Jesus Christ died for every single person on this earth. And I have to tell you, it is a real privilege for me to get to speak in my own church, to my own church family, the things that I do outside. And I'm kind of hoping that this will give you a little bit, get to know me a little better, but it'll also give you a platform to pray for me. January is National Slavery and Human Trafficking Prevention Month. One of the things that I'm particularly recognized in our State Department and our Health and Human Services is that I focus on prevention, and I do that out of my biblical knowledge, growing up believing that the church is to care for the community. Prevention is what we are very well positioned to do. And when I was looking at the roots of human trafficking, looking at poverty, looking at the push factors. Why does someone take a job where they're actually going to become slaves? If someone came and offered you a job, if you go to, let's say, Qatar or Saudi Arabia, and we have lots of stories. We're offering you $10,000 a month, and you're having trouble paying your rent or getting health care. If you could get out of your situation, you would take an opportunity to go for 6 months, make enough money to come back and be ready to go. This is at a site in Colombia where I was a year and a half ago. And I had seen some prevention materials that went out into the community where they told people, don't accept that offer of a job because it isn't real. But if you're living in a tin house like this with no heating, no air conditioning, winter, summer, no privacy, you don't have your own room, and someone offers you a job in California, you might take the risk, even though they told you it might be human trafficking. What have I got to lose? Because see, here is the pull. Dreams. You come to California, you're going to live like Americans live. You're going to have your own house, your own car. Everybody has a car. Everybody has a home. And this dream, combined with where they're coming from, makes people very vulnerable. How can we do a better job of responding to that? When I was first the task force administrator, I met a girl by the name of Shima Hall. By that time, she was about 15, 16. She was rescued in Irvine, California, when she was 12 years old. She was brought to the United States as a child slave. She lived in the garage of a $1.6 million home. And all she did was clean and cook. She stood on a stool to wash dishes. She cleaned the house for a family with 5 children. She wrote her story. It's on the Scholastic book list. If you've got kids that love to read and you want them to understand what slavery looks like in America, get this book for them. Maybe next year we'll bring Shima to speak to us on Freedom Sunday. Shima is a very good friend of mine now. I tease my girls because on Mother's Day, my first text on Sunday, Mother's Day, is from Shima. My kids aren't up yet. But Shima was rescued because somebody in the neighborhood noticed one of the children at that house did not go to school. If you see something that doesn't look right, call the 888-3737, 888 number. You know, in Proverbs 31:8, it says, be a voice for those who have no voice. You don't have to go out and do like I do and go everywhere and do teaching and train hospital workers and law enforcement and community leaders. You just have to have your eyes open and be ready to be a voice and make a difference for someone else. When there were 5 slaves rescued in Irvine a year and a half ago, the Saudi princess had 1 Kenyan and 4 Filipino women that were household slaves. In the last 10 years, our Orange County Human Trafficking Task Force has rescued about 500 slaves in Orange County. Just tell me, raise your hand if you think that wasn't possible. Are you shocked at that number? We have to recognize that this is all around us, and God has given us eyes to see and a voice to make a difference. When I started reading the Bible, looking for ways to teach on human trafficking, I found the very first prevention story. And people say, oh, you're talking about Joseph. Well, actually, that's not prevention. His brothers sold him. I have another friend, young woman, who was sold by her own stepfather. The very first case of human trafficking that I ever encountered was when I was a night nurse in pediatrics, and a 14-year-old boy was admitted because his mother and stepfather were selling him for drugs. I started looking at a prevention story because I believe that it's better to rescue someone before they've been victimized. If they're vulnerable, find a way to intervene before. Don't wait It's a lot easier to restore than it is after they've been victimized. So I found this wonderful story in 2 Kings chapter 4, and I'm going to read it to you. It's only 7 verses. How many of you like a good story? My favorite thing was Sunday school when I was growing up. I loved the Bible stories. I believe that if we teach our kids these stories, they will find principles that stay with them year after year after year. So I remembered when I was looking about 2 Kings chapter 4. It says, one day, the widow of a member of the group of prophets came to Elisha and cried out, "My husband who served you is dead, and you know how he feared the Lord, but now a creditor has come threatening to take my 2 sons as slaves." Debt bondage. This is in the UN protocol. It's in our own law. It's in the Bible. Creditors coming to take her 2 little boys as slaves. "What can I do to help you?" Elisha asked. "Tell me, what do you have in the house?" And the widow answered, "Nothing at all, except a flask of olive oil." And Elisha said, "Borrow as many empty jars as you can from your friends and neighbors. Then go into your house with your sons and shut the door behind you. Pour olive oil from your flask into the jars, setting each one aside when it is filled." So she did as she was told. Her sons kept bringing jars to her, and she filled one after another. Soon every container was full to the brim. "Bring me another jar," she said to one of her sons. "There aren't any more," he told her, and then the oil stopped flowing. When she told the man of God what had happened, he said to her, "Now sell the olive oil and pay your debts, and you and your sons can live on what is left over." Now let's kind of go back through this story and see how the principles apply to where we are right now. Going backwards, I'll go the right direction. So a flask of olive oil. This is not a flask. This is a lamp. This is an oil lamp, very much like the kind that the widow would have had. And that flask was what she carried the extra oil in if she was going to be out after dark. So for you, it would be like carrying a AA battery for your little flashlight if you're going to be out after dark. So a flask of olive oil, look at that lamp. The oil, the little flask, is not very much. And so when the prophet asked her, "What do you have in your house?" and she said, what did she say? She says, "Nothing at all except a flask of olive oil." In her world, a flask of olive oil was nothing. If people came, if welfare came to evaluate whether you need to get assistance, and they ask you, "What do you have?" You would be looking at what kind of resources you have. You wouldn't say, "Oh, I have a pack of batteries." And so that was her mindset then, a flask of olive oil. I was privileged to have young adults over at my house on Friday night for dinner. A flask of olive oil. You can't barely make a salad, let alone cook. I went through a couple of cups of olive oil. That's why it tastes so good. It's the oil. It's the olive oil. You can't cook without oil. Is that right, Ted? A flask of olive oil. So that's why she said she didn't have anything. And the most important thing about that is that we are not the answer. We are not the resource. But let's look and see what the man of God did. Let's see, I think, Amanda, bring your camera. We'll have these 2 boys come in. We'll take some pictures. We'll make a beautiful PowerPoint, and David will play the guitar, and we'll take up a special offering to pay the debt. Is that a good idea? That is not what Elisha did. He didn't even ask to see the boys. He didn't ask their names. He focused on their mom. He focused on their mom. And he sent them out to gather up all the empty vessels. So he engaged the community in the response. Now I could talk to you for an hour about how important it is to engage your community. For one thing, you're going to run out of energy and resources, so you can't do it all by yourselves. You get the whole community. And it said friends and neighbors. So it was people that she knew and people she may not know. And she didn't go around and ask them for money. She came and asked them for something that was empty. Because see, God doesn't need our money. And he doesn't need our resources. He needs willing vessels. You see how I love this part. We sometimes feel like we have to prove some kind of value when God just asks us to be an empty vessel. So the whole community now has some investment in this, although not very much. It's just an empty vessel. And they're kind of curious what they're going to do. What are they going to do with all these? They go in the house, and then they do exactly what the prophet advised them to do. And they started pouring. I love to see olive oil pouring. The first time I ever got to go to an olive oil press, oh, it was fabulous. And when the first fruit, the first oils pouring out of that, we were with one of my husband's students at Hellenic Theological School, and it was an amazing opportunity. He was already a professor at University of Athens and had become a student again to study God's Word. And so he wanted to take us to receive the first fruits of the olive harvest. And that oil came so pure. It's like liquid gold. And in that culture, this would be much more valuable than cash. This was life sustaining. And as that oil started pouring, each of those vessels was filled. And when she asked her son for another vessel, and there weren't any more, the oil stopped. The oil stopped. It was just enough. Now, when I first became the task force administrator, I have to tell you, I had just lost my job at Vanguard because of the financial crisis. And I had been part of the volunteer team that helped start the task force in the early days. And I knew what the job description was for the administrator's role. And I knew I did not qualify. You had to have a criminal justice background. I didn't have that. So they knew that I was losing my job at Vanguard, and they offered me a job, and I said, no, I can't do this. And this Bible story is the reason I said no. Because I explained it to them, because this is in a more secular environment. I said, I can't really do this unless I do it from my faith platform. I'll translate that to church. I can't do this unless God shows up. If God is in it, I can do whatever he calls me to do and tells me to do. Now, you guys all know that we spent 10 years in Greece. We came home fall 2004. We had family. Since we came home, we helped our daughter escape and totally restored from a horrible domestic violence situation. She's happy, she's healthy, her kids, our grandkids are wonderful. Since we came home that year, both of our fathers passed away. Jean's from cancer, mine from Alzheimer. And I didn't know what I was going to do about working out the call of God on my life in combating human trafficking. I'd been going full steam ahead with my friends and colleagues in Greece. And now what am I supposed to do? And so just like 8 weeks after we arrived, I was invited to LA because somebody wanted me to meet Laura Lederer. She was the senior policy advisor to Condoleezza Rice on human trafficking for the State Department. And I listened to the speakers and everything, and I remember feeling, yeah, this all sounds good, but I know what it's like in the trenches, and it isn't this easy. And I got a phone call, and the person calling me, I think, was it you? I don't know. Somebody was just really insistent, so my phone kept not beeping, but vibrating. I had it on silent. And so I finally stepped outside to call back whoever it was. And about that time, Dr. Lederer had gone to the ladies' room, and she was coming back out. And we said hello, and she asked me, so what do you about today, this seminar? And I said, well, I don't think it's that easy. Because I'm going to be honest, right? And I don't think the government's doing enough, whatever. Anyway, and she stopped then. It wasn't just in passing. And she asked me what I'd been doing. And then she changed my direction for being here in the States. She took hold of my wrist like this and held it, and she said, I am so glad that you're a believer, because there is no way we can win without the church. You have to wake up the church. She gave me God's word, his mandate. You have to wake up the church. We can't do this without the church. So what happened? The oil poured, and then it stopped. God was still there. This was God's plan. And here's what happened next. She went out and sold the olive oil and became an olive oil entrepreneur. We never hear about those boys again. They were safe. And in the context of that ancient culture, for a single woman becoming a businesswoman, remember Lydia, same culture, becoming a businesswoman was one way they could survive and take care of their family. So for us, what does that look like in modern times? Well, here's an olive oil entrepreneur. And do we have women like that widow in our communities? Do you know how many single moms there are right here in Westminster? That we can come around them and it'll change everything for their children. Empowering single moms, empowering widows. And in my classes at Vanguard, my students always ask me for a study guide for the final exam. And so I love to point them to James 1:27. And it says, the test of true religion is to care for the widows and orphans and to keep yourself from being polluted by the world. So caring for widows and orphans, for single moms, both of those two cases I told you about, the little girl and the little boy, you had single moms, and the person that preyed upon them became the stepdad, used their children. How many times have we seen someone in our own community and not realized that we could be part of God pouring out his blessings on them to support them? In 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 1 through 7, this is prevention that the church can be involved in. 2 boys, 1 mom, 2 orphans, 1 widow, and God's people, that equals freedom. Now, there are also some other aspects of using that James 1:27. We talk about the widows and the orphans, but it also tells us not to be polluted by the world. So I'm pretty used to being in the classroom, and I would take some time, if we had a little bit more time, and ask you to give me some examples of being polluted by the world. Some of the most obvious things that people often say to me is, well, pornography, because that does drive demand for sex trafficking. But what are some other things where we are polluted by the world. We are among the world's most prolific materialists. We're consumers. I was reading an update on what's happening in China right now, and they've reduced their cost of products so that they can underwrite other countries to get their merchandise to who? To us. Because we want to buy the best for the cheapest price. And you heard what Deputy Chief Marsh said in that video. Greed is one of the driving forces, root causes of human trafficking. So one of the things that we can do is to look at those cheap products and be more responsible for checking out if slave labor is part of it. And that's really not as hard to do. It's not easy as you might think. We have missionary friends in Uzbekistan where cotton plantations are almost entirely, the workers are almost all children on those cotton plantations. And those are children who are working on a plantation instead of being in school. And then we come at the end, instead of in front of, not prevention, we do after, and we send big programs over to educate children. But if they hadn't been working on a plantation, they would have been in school. And we actually have help. Department of Labor now produces every 2 years a list of goods produced by child labor and forced labor. So this one just came out in 2014, and it says there are 123 products and 74 countries where those products are on our shelves. And when we purchase them, we drive demand for more slavery. And so one of the things that I just loved in the bulletin, Heather writes encouraging things so that we'll be involved. And she says, the stories and statistics can be so overwhelming as to convince us of our inability to effectively do anything in the face of such evil. So if we think of those people and us, we versus them, we can become hopeless and powerless because it's overwhelming. But we can actually do something. We can do something. One of the things that we do at Vanguard, we have a Live2Free club, and one of the presidents, past presidents, was going to be here today and texted me at 7:30 this morning that she's sick. But she sent me some slides of this club. They go out into the schools. If you've got people you want them to come to, they will. And their mission is not to talk about all of the things with sex trafficking and things. Sex trafficking is one part of human trafficking, but it's much bigger. They exist to challenge a generation to make personal choices that recognize the dignity of the individual, the responsibility of consumers to slow demand that drives modern-day slavery. That is their mission. And they use slides like this to talk about the different kinds of slavery. And then they encourage not a negative. They don't make a list of the products that are made with slavery. They make a list of the products where people are working hard to be responsible and to choose to support families. When I first learned about the child labor on the west coast of Africa on the cocoa plantations, I learned about that in 2007. And all of a sudden, I didn't evaluate which chocolate bar to buy because I did not give up chocolate, let me tell you that. I did not evaluate which chocolate bar to buy based on price anymore. I had to be a good steward in God's eyes. So now, instead of buying a 99-cent candy bar, I buy a $2, actually, the dark, in case anybody needs to know this, my favorite is dark chocolate Trader Joe's, and it's fair trade. Yeah, Ted likes it too, good. And it's $2 instead of 79 cents. But here's the deal. I'm a good steward because that $2 guarantees that a father is getting paid a fair wage so he can support his children so they can go to school. That year, I saw the picture of a boy who had run away from one of the plantations, and when they showed the bottom of his feet, they were scarred to remind him he couldn't run away. So now the 79 cents has, in my mind, a picture of a little boy's scarred feet, and the price is too high. Just choices. Your choices, my choices, our community's choices. That changes life. When I first started working on human trafficking, I heard a wonderful illustration in India, a rural area, the director of a mental health institution, they called it an insane asylum, but that's not politically correct anymore, was asked, how do you tell when someone is ready to be released from your institution? They're not literate, they don't pass out Scantrons. Said, oh, it's very easy. We take a bucket outside, we put it under a faucet, we turn the faucet on, and then we give a spoon to the patient and ask them to empty the bucket. And if they start emptying the bucket without turning off the faucet, they get to stay. Because that is the definition of insanity. What we have to do is to turn off the faucet. That means we have to reduce demand. We have to empower families, especially single moms who have no other resources and they're looking for help. We have to identify the needs in our own backyard, right here in Westminster. When I challenge churches, I love to show them a picture of this big vessel. I started off with a tiny little flask. This is called a pithari. This particular one, I took this picture on the island of Crete in the Knossos Palace. And when I saw this vessel, give you some context, I could stand up inside of it and you wouldn't see the top of my head. Now, that wouldn't work for other people, but I'm vertically challenged, so it would work for me. And they would take these out into the field when they harvested olives, when they harvested wheat, and fill them full. And then, this is 3,000 years ago, they didn't have a cart and wagon to pull them in with. Then, how did they get them to the king's palace and down into the pantry? The people were about 5'1", very slight. And so they put handles all over. I mean, all the way down, all the way to the top. And 10 or 15 people grabbed a handle to move it forward. And I believe that there is a handle for every single person in our church and in our community. And the reason it is so important is because this is God's heart. I need to borrow a $20 bill. David, do you have a 20? Anybody have a $20 bill? Oh, good. I'll take it. Okay. So, Betsy, whose face is there?
Andrew Jackson.
Very good, very good. Andrew Jackson. Whose face is on a $5 bill? Lincoln, good. Who's on a $100 bill? Yeah, I didn't know that for a long time, but when I go to high schools, they always knew that. And so when I do this to your $20 bill, and then I stomp on it, wish it was raining and I had mud on my shoes. I did this at a boys' high school up in LA, 800 boys, and I have never heard such a collective gasp as, oh, look at that. And then the young man who loaned me the $20, I said, so I'm really sorry about this. This is really bad, and you don't want it back. His response, yes, I do. And I said, well, but it's probably worth as much now as it was. He said, yeah. I said, probably, you know, I'm going to owe you like $3.24 because I damaged it. And he said, no, I want it back. And he came up and got it, even though it was a mess and it was raining that day. And this is why the church is called to this issue. Because every one of you, every one of them, are stamped in the image of God. Imago Dei, God's face, ensures that they are valuable, and whatever they've been through does not change their value in God's eyes or in our eyes. We have to be intentional in seeing God's face in the most marginalized, the most vulnerable, and the most victimized, right here in Westminster, on the other side in Garden Grove, in Orange County, in California, in our nation, and around the world. Amen.